Welcome to another episode of Bright Insights, the podcast that leads you to less stress and more success. Here's your host, Paul Bright.
Welcome to another episode of Bright Insights. I'm your host, Paul Bright. The bottom line up front for this episode, D is for diversity. Increasing diversity increases your success. Are you surrounded by clones? People who act and do as you do since you're the leader? Are you surrounded by yes people? Group thinkers? Is your organization's progress at a standstill? If you said yes to any of these questions, this episode is definitely for you. Diversity is a hot topic in the workplace, even if you aren't responsible for the initial hires. Let's say you took over an organization. You could end up being the one having to answer questions if you are being charged with forms of discrimination because your work center's employees all look the same. That sounds a little scary. I mean, who wants those type of distractions when you need to lead? No one does. But at the same time, not everyone recognizes a lack of diversity or, frankly, knows what to do about it. Fortunately, I brought to you an interview with a leading expert on diversity, University of California, Davis's Dr. Cynthia Pickett. I encourage you to listen so you can have a lot less stress and more success in your workplace by truly addressing diversity. D for diversity. We're talking about diversity in the workplace. Dr. Cynthia Pickett, is that how you prefer to be called, or is it Cindy Pickett?
I go by many names.
Many
yes.
names.
But Cindy. For today's purposes.
For today's purposes, you are Cindy. Great. And your current position?
I am a professor at UC Davis in the psychology department, and I'm also in academic affairs as the associate Vice-Provost for faculty equity and inclusion.
Faculty equity and inclusion. So what's entailed with that for those who are not necessarily familiar with the school system?
So basically, I work on how to recruit and retain faculty, particularly faculty of color.
Okay.
And also looking at, gender and other, forms of diversity, but really focusing on the faculty ranks at UC Davis. And so right now we work on, projects designed to improve climate, or how do we change maybe job ads so that they attract more diverse applicants. And so that's all stuff I work on.
Oh, that's nice. That's very interesting. And you said you're a psychology professor, so I imagine you're still teaching classes.
Yes, I teach a course once a year, at least, on the psychology of the self. And sometimes I also teach a course on social cognition.
On social cognition?
Mm-hmm. So looking at how our thought processes and judgments, emotions are affected by the social environment.
Oh, it's very good to know. Very good to hear. That's definitely going to come up a little bit later in this interview. And so how did you end up landing there? How did you end up landing there from undergrad to here you are?
Well, so back in high school, I took an AP psychology course and fell in love with the subject matter. But even before then, I always had an interest in understanding how people ticked. So why is it that they behave in the ways that they do, particularly when those behaviors on the surface may seem maladaptive? And so given that I always had that curiosity, psychology was just a natural fit. And so after high school, I majored in psychology and then decided to continue. And I went on to graduate school to get my PhD, and then was lucky enough to get a tenure track faculty job out of grad school where I could continue to study psychology, do research on it, teach, and it's been my life for 25 years now.
25 years in the business.
I know.
You keep scaling up. And I know that you're also involved in not just the school, but your own local community. Mm-hmm. You were elected to the school board, I believe?
Yes, so I'm a trustee for the Davis Joint Unified School District, and I'm board president this year. And one of my interests in terms of running was this issue of diversity and inclusion, and how do we make our school district more inclusive, and how do we, can I bring certain issues to the table that may, be overlooked, particularly if that's not a community that you have a lot of contact with.
Oh, okay.
And so I felt that with my ties in the community, I could really help to make that more of a discussion.
Okay. And so I've known you for a bit, and I'll explain exactly how long I've known you and why I've known you towards the end of this podcast. But it seems like, given your natural background, you're a good fit for diversity and inclusion. So explain a little bit of that, how you may not necessarily have grown up as how most kids grow up in America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this actually influenced my research area as well. So half Filipino and half African American. And one of the things I noticed in my family as, growing up is that, so we have a lot of family members who are half African American, half Filipino, but we identify in different ways and in different contexts. So depending on who we are around, sometimes we'll think of ourselves as being Filipino, sometimes we think of ourselves more in terms of being Black. And so that fascinated me, that there's this fluidity in terms of identity. And even though group memberships might be the same, how we think about ourselves and then how we feel about ourselves and the kind of thoughts and attitudes that we have can really change, in terms of the context that you're in. And so that really was my research focus, how the context shapes our identity.
Understandable, totally understandable. And you can even be Filipino in a different state in the country, and it's not the same as being Filipino in Southern California as it is to being Filipino in the Bay Area of California, or Black in all those same situations. Myself, I found it a lot more relaxed in the Bay Area to be of more than one race or socioeconomic status or anything like that. It seems a lot more relaxed over here to not feel like I'm on the edge just because of how people may be approaching me, just from the surface. But that makes a lot of sense. That part of that being in your background. And have you lived in California all your life? I don't believe so.
Mostly. So since the age of about 6. So I went through school, grade school, elementary school, high school in California, in San Diego in particular, which actually has a fairly large Filipino population. And so interestingly, I felt in some ways less Filipino in San Diego compared to a context where there are fewer Filipinos.
I get that. So in a sense, because your ethnicity was the norm in your community there, even though it may not be so much nationwide, you felt less Filipino in a way?
It was more that when you have a group where the prototype is pretty clear, what that does is it makes also clear who's on the margins.
Oh, okay.
And so that's really the dynamic that takes place there.
I see. Yeah, that's neat. I'd never really thought about it that way. And so I know that inclusion, like the field that you're working in the school, it looks at that, obviously, because you're working on being able to make available options for faculty to say, hey, yeah, come teach at UC Davis, come work over here. Because for students, once they graduate, maybe they see all the diversity at UC Davis or Berkeley or some other school out here, or even in other states, but they go into the working world and it may not necessarily be the same. Do you get any feedback like that from people who've moved on from the school or moved on to different jobs?
Certainly they notice a difference. So the UC system generally, and also UC Davis, has a very diverse student body. And we have a lot of first-generation students as well, coming from Central California and different areas. And when they leave UC Davis, they realize that is not the norm. And particularly in certain sectors, if you're looking at tech or even education, graduate school, it looks very different. And that can sometimes be difficult when you're used to having that diversity. But that certainly is the case, and we see that.
I get that. If you start getting people that are very qualified and they show up, and it's like, that's not normally who shows up to apply for jobs. So let's talk about that, because I know a lot of these listeners are first-time leaders. They've been thrown into the wolves, or they apply for a management position but have not managed before, or they're entrepreneurs that are starting to hire people. And they probably don't want to get in trouble. They might be thinking, if I don't have some sort of diversity, I could be sued. There's legal actions they can take, but that may not be the case. So what if I was like starting my own business, something like construction? And it turns out that where I live and where I start my business, it's mostly males that apply. Mostly males that show up, mostly males that end up hiring. Am I doing something wrong if that's the case, if women aren't applying?
Well, I wouldn't phrase it as doing something wrong. So there are differences in applicant pools in terms of, we call it workforce availability.
Okay.
And one of the things I track at the university is the availability of looking at both gender and ethnic racial background of certain subfields, academic fields. And really what comes into play is that if you're looking at a field that you know that about half the available workforce is female, and yet who you are seeing in your applicant pools, you're only maybe seeing 20% females, then that gives you a heads up that maybe there's something in particular that you're doing. Maybe you're not advertising widely, or maybe there's a reputation that exists that could be problematic. But having low numbers per se isn't how you assess whether there's a problem.
Okay.
It really is, given what we know about the workforce, why does this not mirror, why does my own applicant pool, why does my job site not mirror that applicant pool, what's available?
Okay.
And again, in terms of federal discrimination laws, it really is, can they demonstrate, or can someone demonstrate, for example, that you have policies that are actually discriminating against these protected classes? So you can't get in trouble just by having lack of diversity. It really is, someone would have to actually make a case that you're doing something to actually discriminate against protected classes.
I see. So if you just happen to be in an area where your workforce pool is 100 males and 20 females, and you end up hiring 10 males and 2 females, you're not necessarily discriminating, because that sort of fits the percentages of what's going on.
Exactly. But that being said, we can still try to do better, right? So if you look at the field of engineering, that is a typical breakdown, that about 80% male, 20% or less, 15% female. But if you are part of an organization that really wants to improve its diversity, there are things you could do in terms of reaching out, networking, targeted outreach, trying to find people to apply for the position. So if you know you have a position coming up, reaching out to your network, or going to the Society of Women Engineers and tabling at that conference. Those are things that I guess what I'm saying is you have to be proactive.
Oh, okay.
So if you just do nothing, you're probably going to get something that reflects the usual numbers.
I see. So even if my job doesn't necessarily, or what I'm going to hire doesn't necessarily employ women as a whole, if there's a society that's specific to that, I could say, hey, just letting you know I have jobs available. Here are the slots. I'm not guaranteeing, in my mind, I'm not going to guarantee a hire. You got to pass the test. You got to qualify. But at least I'm putting it out there that this is available, so it doesn't look like I'm excluding. And that probably doesn't seem like it takes a lot of work. And that's something I was going to bring up because, maybe a job like construction, maybe I say, this is a heavy duty job. I need to hire somebody who can carry 2 50-pound sandbags from point A to point B. And so that's my big test. Physically, maybe the women in the area don't necessarily meet that requirement. Am I still being inclusive?
So what we see a lot is that when there's a very narrow definition of what, for example, makes for a good construction worker, then it's harder to create diversity, because you're looking at one dimension that may just favor one group of individuals. But if I have a construction company and I want to be successful in this company, I probably want construction workers, some of whom are very strong, some of whom can direct others, some of whom can manage conflicts that arise. And so there's a whole wide range of skills. And for some of those skills, you might see that it isn't the biggest people. It's not, and you're not favoring males. And so what we try to do is encourage people when they think about job ads is to think inclusively and really challenge themselves in terms of what is excellent, what makes for a good employee in that context. And part of the problem is that when you're ingrained in a particular system, you don't see all the, how it could potentially be better if you're actually bringing in different qualities.
Yeah.
And, but again, it requires that being proactive, being willing to not continue to think in the same ways.
Understandable. 10 years in the Air Force, I spent a good 6 of them on the flight line as a jet engine mechanic for cargo planes. And so we worked on giant engines, and there was a lot of heavy parts, but there were also a lot of very delicate areas. But
exactly.
I would say that 80% of the job had less to do with being able to, what we would say, turn wrenches, but more to do with troubleshooting, finding exactly what's wrong so that we fix it right the first time. And that's not something that's biased by gender. Work ethic didn't seem to be biased by gender. We had females out there that were stronger than the males. When I first got there, I didn't weigh very much, and I had to pick up this toolbox, which was like 50 pounds, and I was just really, really struggling to get it up there with one hand. And this lady comes over, and she, boom, just puts it right up there. And she looks at me, she goes, "You'll get used to it." I was like, okay. And she was right. It took some time, but that was just the nature of the job. So I get what you're saying. People can broaden what they feel like is what really would make my company successful. Does it have to do with females? Does it have to do with males? And these typical stereotypes necessarily, or does it have to do with what's actually need to be done in the job? Because we had very big, strong people who couldn't lead a horse to water. So understandable.
Yeah, I was reading a book about a Navy SEAL, and part of what he was talking about is that it wasn't the strongest individuals that came in that succeeded necessarily. It had to do with a mindset. And when he talked about some of those qualities, I'm like, well, that sounds a lot like a woman going through natural childbirth, just being willing to take pain.
Yeah.
So thinking about those qualities.
Right. We sometimes will look at diversity about the things we talked about gender and about race, maybe even sexual orientation. Maybe that's more, probably a lot more talked about here in California than other parts of the country, and that's starting to spread out. What are some other areas of diversity that we may not necessarily be talking about?
Yeah, and I would say that the fact that there's such a focus on race and gender is really a holdover from our federal laws, where those were the categories that tended to be focused on, and we are seeing change. But in California, first generation status is something that in the UC system, as we're focusing on more. And what we're finding is that when we think about the barriers that students face, a lot of it is an information gap. So what is a syllabus, right?
Right.
If you grew up in a family where your older siblings were going to college, where your parents went to college, you might have a question. Your parent would say, well, go look in the syllabus. But if that isn't your family background, you wouldn't know to look there.
Right.
And what may seem crazy to one person is actually, if you're sensitive to the culture, seems very normal. And so that's what we're realizing is impacting our students. In addition to race and gender and sexual orientation, there are these other factors too that we really need to pay attention to if we're going to serve the students.
Understandable. So first generation students, those would be the first ones in their families to go to college. And so if they're not growing up in a house where you talked about academic things which you needed to be successful, so that's definitely something to consider. And I can see that in the workforce as well. If you have people that have never worked in labor,
exactly,
but they're wanting to work, they're wanting to do these type of things. They may not necessarily be used to the hours, the time it takes to do certain things, how to take care of themselves when they're, off work versus the guy who this is the son of the son of the son of who've been working on farms since the 1800s.
Yeah. I mean, as a side note, in the Davis Joint Unified District, we just revamped our career and technical education pathways for our high school students. And a lot of that is trying to provide these opportunities, these internships, and just knowledge. Well, how do you get it? How do you become a union electrician, and why is it important? What's union versus not union, and things like that kind of knowledge. That if you've been in a family of union workers, you understand that. If not, you might not, and that would greatly impact your job opportunities.
Yeah.
And so someone needs to be providing that information, but first you have to be sensitive to the fact that not everyone has the information.
Right. So can't assume that everybody who applies or wants to work for you necessarily knows all those details of what it takes to do the job when they work for you.
Exactly.
Just because they can type fast doesn't necessarily mean they know how to do this or that. I would see ageism is another thing that has to come with diversity. You have an age gap with technology. You might have a guy or a woman that you want to hire that has some really good leadership skills, but not necessarily the technical skills.
Yes.
And so they may feel like they're being excluded when it comes to hiring, just because I've heard that before with some of the clients I've worked with. Nobody's going to hire me. I'm 55 years old. I'm 65 years old. Everything has to do with computers, and I don't have the time to learn.
So I made the mistake early on once so a lot of my lab work in the psychology department is computer based. And I had a research assistant who was older, but was having difficulty with the computer software and data entry software that we were using. And I saw that as a problem, but she also had these other skills, like in terms of managing the other. So my mistake was not valuing the other skills that she brought to the table and focusing in this one area of technology. And thinking back to that, I always think about that. That was just a real mistake,
right?
A blind spot that I had,
right? Probably very well organized, might have systems in place to do everything else, and maybe this is the part that holds her back is the technology part, but all these other things that bring value to your lab.
I know nowadays with kids, there's these adulting 101 classes being offered, because they don't know how to write a check.
Right.
They don't know how to do really basic skills, and so to assume that the younger generation is, where it's, they have their own struggles.
They do. It's just a matter of realigning those skills to something that works and saying, you can do this, therefore you can learn how to do that.
Yeah.
So it makes a lot of sense to me. Ageism might be an area in diversity that we should consider if we're going to be hiring people. Not necessarily if somebody is older, that doesn't mean they're not a good fit for your organization if it's in tech or if it's in engineering or something like that. And I would think there's a lot of diversity benefits to having a diverse workforce. I was thinking, let's say that imaginary construction company that I had, it turns out that a lot of their clients are older African American women. If I were to hire somebody that was closer to that age range and was from that same neighborhood or same area, it seems like there would be a lot more production, a lot more referrals, a lot more of, these people, they understand me because they know what it's like to live here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so and some companies recognize that, right? So if I'm a hospital, I might recognize that some of my clients they're going to want to have a practitioner who they feel comfortable with, and that may, they may need to hire people so that there is that similarity. But even beyond that, there is a lot of interesting work. A lot of it's being done in business schools, but looking at how the diversity of, for example, a team or an organization changes the outcomes. So are you making better decisions? Is there better performance? And a good example is that when you have women on teams, information tends to be shared more. And when you mention like trying to solve a problem or troubleshooting, often troubleshooting requires all the information to be on the table. And once everyone sees all of the information, then you can then figure out the solution. So if you've ever done an escape room and there are people who are holding on to clues, you'll never leave that room. Right. And that really is oftentimes what an organization is like.
Right.
But when women are at the table, they tend to say, well, Joe, we haven't heard from you. what information do you have?
Right.
Whereas men, for, probably because of socialization, tend to just want to talk about, they'll talk over each other more, and there's not as much turn taking and sharing. And then ultimately the solution is not as good.
Understandable. Right. And, people like us in the field, we're trained to look at those type of things, male, female, what have you. I've taught these type of classes of these communications, and I can vouch for that. Yeah. I've seen it happen before my eyes 2 years in a row when I was teaching leadership classes. And
exactly.
We would just let it run its course to see what happens, and then we'd make adjustments. And these were people that we were training to be leaders.
Yeah.
So I can totally see that. Even in the mental health field, out in the field doing community outreach and counseling, you have certain communities that just will not trust speaking to somebody that is Caucasian because they associate Caucasians with being authority and in the force, and you want more information. And so you might get somebody like me, even though I'm educated the same as everyone else, I have the same skill set as everybody else. Just because of how I look on the surface, it's like, okay, this guy will listen to me. Mm-hmm. Whether it's right or wrong, exactly. The perception is enough to get the information. And when we get the information, we can make progress. So that is definitely a good benefit to having diversity, just because, hey, people will talk to who they feel more familiar with.
And we've probably had this experience, too, where there's an ad that comes out or a product that comes out, and you wonder, how did it get this far before someone noticed that this was going to be a problematic?
So many times.
Whose eyes were on this?
Yeah.
So there was the example that happened over Halloween where there was a pumpkin, and it was painted black. And the store probably thought this was just a chic looking pumpkin. Mm-hmm. But for many people, they saw it and it looked like blackface.
Yeah.
And you wonder, did anyone who was black see that pumpkin before it went to market? And it was a costly mistake for the company.
Right.
They had to apologize, retract all the product. And so, again, having more eyes on it, different viewpoints, can help. But then also, for me, not being in a bubble. So when we think about ideological or diversity, right? And so realizing that even though the people I normally talk to agree with me on these points, other people might not, but I won't know that, and I won't know what the arguments are against or for, unless I actually have those people in the room. Absolutely.
So you have to diverse yourself just from all these different perspectives. And in the case of that pumpkin looking like blackface, mm-hmm. What if there was a foreign company? They may have had black people on their staff, but if they're not from America, they may not necessarily see the cultural aspects of having that, because that's not been their experience growing up. That's not part of history, and they're part of Europe or Africa or what have you, to say, oh, this does not look right. So in it seems like in those senses, you would want somebody, if it was a foreign company that did that, that's just from America. Yep. White, black, or whatever, to go, whoa, that's not going to look right, whatever you intend that to look like. Yep. That is not going to come out right.
And I think we're all learning. So even though I work in this space of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I find myself using phrases like low person on the totem pole.
Yes.
Or let's have a meeting, we can powwow about it.
Yeah.
And when I make those mistakes, it's really just being open to being corrected and then changing my behavior and then moving on.
Right.
Right. And so we're all a kind of work in progress.
Yeah, it's all stuff we're looking at. None of the things that we're saying here are things that we believe. They're just common phrases that come out. Even Disney's doing that when they put all their movies, their classic movies, mm-hmm. on their Disney Plus. They're putting stuff in like, hey, this is what we knew at the time. This is what everyone was experiencing at the time. Mm-hmm. And we're just putting a disclaimer out there. We're not saying it's right or wrong. We're just saying this is the way it was back then, for sure. And we're all in those spaces to learn. It doesn't matter where we come from and how, like you said, we're in the field, so we think our ears are open to everything, and they're not. They're not necessarily. Not everybody that disagrees with your opinions or comes from a different type of lifestyle doesn't mean they can't work with you or for you.
Exactly.
So it does help to have some diversity, because you get more potential answers on the table, and all your blind spots.
Yes.
Your blind spots can be covered.
But to benefit from that diversity, right, you have to be willing to be called out. And so that was the point I was trying to make.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah, that's true. You got to be able to be, you got to have that humble, like, okay, what am I missing here? What is it that you're seeing that's not working? And in some cases, especially for someone like me, who's just going to be like, blah, 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 here's how I feel. I have to stop and look at the quiet person in the room and take them to the side. It's like, did I miss something? Let me know, because you're watching. I can tell you're watching.
Yep.
What did I miss, or what should I consider? And hear that and go, oh, okay, yeah.
And and since you mentioned that, for leaders, this is crucially important, right? Because everyone is looking at the leader too and taking stock of what that reaction is, and so modeling how you deal with these blips that come up is really important.
True. Your language. I have an episode coming up, Ellis, for language, and it's about how your words as a leader, when you're in that position, carry a lot more weight. You can't necessarily say the same things that you said with your coworkers now that you're in charge, or when you're the face of the company because you're the only person in the company, you're hiring people. You coming in there and saying, oh, this is going to be a crap day, means 10 times more than if you were just saying it to yourself or with your buddies. And in the case of diversity and hiring people, and the jokes that you make and whatever common language you're used to using is going to have a lot more weight to it as well. So that's definitely something to consider. Those very phrases that we use are like, oh, that's what that means? That's where that comes from?
Well, I actually, before I publicly say something, I will often Google. It doesn't take that long, but I realize that's a phrase. I don't know the history or the origin of that phrase. Let me just take 30 seconds to do a quick Google.
Yeah. Keep yourself out of trouble as much as possible.
Yeah. And it doesn't take that much time.
No, it doesn't. And even people like us who are of color, it doesn't mean we don't get a pass. It doesn't mean, oh, I'm of color, therefore I can say this, therefore I can do that, and people will understand. You almost put yourself in a worse position because not everything that is divisive is limited to white people or rich people. It can be anybody that does that. So you have to throw your status out of that way too. Thank you for this interview. I really appreciate your opinions. Yes, it does help when you know people in these positions. Helps even more when they're your relatives, like Cindy is.
Yes.
My cousin, I don't know, what are we, second or third or something like that? Our moms were cousins.
Yes, yes. But lived in the Philippines together.
Lived in the Philippines. Ran back and forth. When you're part of, and people that have been following my podcast, they know that I'm a military brat and I served. But being raised in the Philippines and the States, it was common practice for you to stay with your family members wherever they were at. So you passed to and fro through the same houses and had the same relatives everywhere. And so, spot on, off and on seeing each other as kids, and then just happened to be living not even 45 minutes from each other as adults with our own kids. So we get to see each other a lot more. And I'm super proud that Cindy agreed to do this interview because of where she's at and how far she's come and the great family that she's been raising. And I just want to say thank you again.
You're welcome. And you can pay me back with lumpia.
There you go. We'll do. Oh, no. The secret's out. Okay.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Bright Insights. For more information on how to have less stress and more success, visit brightinsightsmedia.com.
If you enjoyed this episode in particular, or the Bright Insights podcast overall, subscribe and share with your friends. That gives us a little more visibility. And with that, we can all have less stress and more success.